Tel Aviv, May 14, 1948. A short man with disheveled grey hair stands before an excited crowd, reading a document that will go down in history as the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. Yes, right here and now, the Jews proclaim that after 2,000 years spent in oppression, scattered across the globe, they will once again have their own state. In Palestine, on the land that, as the Bible says, was promised to them by God. It is an incredible story in which that short man, David Ben-Gurion, plays the leading role. He had worked towards the creation of this state for over 40 years, tirelessly encouraging his people along the winding road that led to its establishment. And now he will lead it as its first prime minister. At this moment, however, he has no idea what will come next. Declaring a state is one thing, keeping it is quite another. The man was born in 1886 as David Grun, far from Palestine in the Polish town of Płonsk, near Warsaw. The Jewish community there was strong and his parents were not poor. They owned 2 houses. David received a solid education. Starting at the age of 3, his grandfather taught him the language of the Bible, Hebrew, something quite unusual at the time, as everyone else spoke Yiddish, a language most similar to German. When David was 10 years old, his family was struck like lightning by a publication titled The Jewish State by journalist Theodor Herzl. Herzl was the first to articulate the idea that Jews in Europe, who had faced recurring pogroms and waves of anti-Semitism for centuries, should move elsewhere, ideally back to Palestine, from where they had been expelled by the Romans in the 1st century AD. Other options, such as Argentina, Cyprus, or Uganda, were also discussed. The Grun family was captivated by this idea, and teenage David most of all. With his friends, he founded a club where they spoke only Hebrew, as they believed that this should be the language spoken in the new state. Their decision to leave Europe was hastened by a wave of Eastern European pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century, during which thousands of people were killed in cities like Odessa, Kyiv, Kishinev, and others. There was no longer time to wait. In September 1906, the 19-year-old David, with substantial financial support from his father, stepped off a ship into the promised land, Palestine. The initial euphoria quickly gives way to a harsh reality. At that time, there were only about 50,000 Jews living in Palestine, some who had remained there since biblical times, and others who had arrived in recent years following Theodor Herzl's call. The land had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 500 years, and the overwhelming majority of its inhabitants were Palestinian Arabs, who, understandably, did not welcome the new arrivals. David Grun spends several months scraping by as a hired farm laborer, picking apples or grapes. He goes hungry, eventually contracts malaria, and the doctor tells him that if he stays in Palestine, he likely won't survive. He is slight, has a fragile constitution, and the hard manual labor combined with the unfamiliar climate doesn't suit him. However, he perseveres and presses on. He says, if we are to live in this land, we must cultivate it with our own hands. Eventually, he managed to find work in Jerusalem at one of the first Jewish newspapers. Few people could speak Hebrew as fluently as he could, so he became an editor and soon a prominent Jewish activist. He also decides to adopt a Hebrew name, and in honor of Joseph Ben-Gurion, a commander of the 1st century revolt against the Romans, he chooses his new surname, Ben-Gurion. Everything changes with the First World War. The Ottomans abandon their previously friendly policy toward the Jews, and David is deported to Egypt. From there, he escapes across the ocean to New York. There, he begins a campaign to recruit Jews to return to Palestine. As it soon turns out, his greatest catch is Paula Munweis, an American Jew originally from Minsk, whom David marries. They will have 1 son and 2 daughters, and she will stand by him until the end of her life, even though he will prove to be almost useless for family life. As their children will later say, Mom built the family and Dad built the state. But let's return to our story. With the end of the First World War, the situation in Palestine changed dramatically. After the Ottomans, who lost the war, the territory comes under the administration of Great Britain. Through the so-called Balfour Declaration, named after Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, Britain gives the green light to the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. And what happens next? From war-torn Europe, tens of thousands of Jews begin to arrive, gradually transforming the face of the sleepy agricultural Palestine. They purchase land from Arabs, build new cities. For example, Tel Aviv rises entirely from an empty field, and establish self-sufficient agricultural collectives known as kibbutzim. It is a time of rapid change, and Ben-Gurion plays a key role in organizing all of this. He excels at it. His talent for compromise proves particularly useful because, as the saying goes, when 5 Jews gather, there are 6 opinions on everything. In 1920, Ben-Gurion first led the Jewish labor union, Histadrut. In 1930, he united several leftist parties into one, called Mapai, which became the strongest Jewish political group in the country. By 1935, by then his hair was beginning to turn white, he logically became the head of the Jewish Agency, which serves as the unofficial government of the Jews in British Palestine. By that time, nearly 500,000 Jewish immigrants had arrived, making up almost half of the local Arab population. It is therefore no surprise that in 1936 an Arab uprising broke out, with Palestinians launching large-scale attacks on Jewish towns and settlements. Ben-Gurion takes a moderate stance, ordering the defense organization known as Haganah to show restraint. However, chaos grips the entire country, and the threat of civil war looms. In response, the British made a shocking turn. In May 1939, the British government announced a new policy outlined in the so-called White Paper, which effectively excluded the possibility of a Jewish state and drastically limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to just 15,000 people per year. For context, Adolf Hitler was already fully implementing his insane anti-Semitic policies. In Germany, Kristallnacht had already occurred, a pogrom during which synagogues were plundered and set on fire, and Czechoslovakia had already been occupied. It is clear that many European Jews would now like to flee to Palestine, but the doors are closed. Ben-Gurion faces an incredibly difficult choice. At the outbreak of World War II, he could not fight against the British alongside the greatest anti-Semite, Hitler. So once again he chooses compromise. He establishes a Jewish brigade to help the British fight the Nazis, while simultaneously supporting illegal immigration into the country. The situation becomes completely absurd after the war, when the whole world is already aware of the horrors of the Holocaust. Ships arrive at the shores of Palestine, packed to the brim with people who, often by a miracle, survived the hell of Nazi concentration camps. Yet the British refuse to let them enter the country. Instead, they are locked up again behind barbed wire, this time in refugee camps in Cyprus. Even Ben-Gurion loses his patience. For a limited time, he allies himself with the most radical Jewish resistance groups, Irgun and Lehi, and sanctions armed struggle, including the use of terrorist methods. The peak of this escalation is a bomb attack on the British administrative headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which kills 91 people. For the British, this is too much. They decide to leave Palestine by May 15, 1948, and the question of what happens next is handed over to the newly established United Nations. The United Nations Commission comes up with a proposal. Palestine will be divided into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. The proposed borders are indeed peculiar, and the Jewish state would, according to the plan, have a 45% Arab minority. Nevertheless, Ben-Gurion agrees to the plan. To the many opponents, he repeatedly says, "Right now, we have nothing, and this is better than nothing. Besides, this is just the beginning. Who knows how things will develop further?" The Arabs, on the other hand, reject any Jewish claim to Palestinian land and reject the plan as a whole. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted. The Jews need the support of 31 states. All the great powers except Britain vote in favor, while all the Arab states naturally vote against it.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
It is a momentous occasion. Jews in Palestine celebrate enthusiastically, and Ben-Gurion, along with others, dances the traditional dance known as the Hora. Half a year later, on May 14, 1948, just a few hours before the British officially left Palestine, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי, בה עוצבה דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית.
According to the declaration, the new state will be called Israel, although there were proposals for names like Judea or Zion. It will be a republic with a democratic government, free elections, and freedom of religion. The only Jewish-specific aspects will be that the Sabbath, Saturday, will be a day of rest, state institutions will prepare kosher food, and Orthodox believers will be exempt from military service. Ben-Gurion is 62 years old, and the dream of many generations of Jews seems to have come true. But for now, all of this exists only on paper. Israel will have to fight for its existence. The very next day, war begins with all of Israel's Arab neighbors. As Prime Minister and also Minister of Defense, Ben-Gurion is responsible for leading the war effort. He has only 30,000 men, while regular armies from 7 neighboring states stand against him. Yet he manages to succeed. Thanks to the rapid purchase of heavy weapons and aircraft, particularly from Czechoslovakia, and the swift arming of additional men, the catastrophe was avoided. After a year, aided in part by huge disagreements within the Arab coalition, the War of Independence ended. Israel not only survives, but also controls 21% more territory than the original UN plan allotted. The flip side of the coin is that 700,000 Palestinians were forced to leave their homes and began living in refugee camps in surrounding countries. This sense of historical injustice on the Arab side would eventually lead to further Arab-Israeli wars. But let's return to David Ben-Gurion. He would serve as Israel's prime minister, with a short break, for a total of 13 years. During his leadership, he stabilized the country and resolved the economic crisis of the 1950s by accepting West German reparations for the Holocaust. His negotiations with German Chancellor Adenauer, just 7 years after the war ended, triggered massive protests across the country. But Ben-Gurion stood firm. In 1956, he also weathered the Suez Crisis, during which Israel unsuccessfully assisted the British and French in trying to control the Suez Canal in Egypt. And it was Ben-Gurion who, in 1960, sent an Israeli commando to Argentina to capture Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann's execution 2 years later remains the only execution in Israel's history. David Ben-Gurion voluntarily stepped down as prime minister in 1963. He was 77 years old, and in his later years, he and his wife Paula moved to a kibbutz in the Negev desert in southern Israel. He would often say, "Here is our future, because here we are not taking anyone's place." Life in a simple bungalow and working in the fields seemed to bring him back 60 years to when he made the greatest decision of his life, to leave his home in order to find, build, and defend a new home, for himself and for his people who had dreamed of such a thing for 2,000 years.